In our quest to bridge from the theory to the practice of business and entrepreneurship, how important is the theory part? Let's review with Per Bylund.
This is the Economics for Business podcast. We're here to help all businesses become champions for customers and value, improving lives with preferred and innovative products and services. We offer you the knowledge and tools to make your entrepreneurial journey a successful one. Now, here's your host, Hunter Hastings.
Hi, Hunter Hastings here. At Economics for Business, we aim to demonstrate how businesses can do better by utilizing good economic theory and applying it effectively in specific business situations. Is the economic theory part really any use? We make the case that it's indispensable. A doctor has a theory of medicine in mind when diagnosing a patient. If the patient has a persistent cough, theory yields several possibilities as to why the patient is coughing, and the doctor applies the theory to the specific data gathered from the specific patient in the specific situation. Otherwise, the doctor's only guessing. Every one of us in business has a theory of how the customer's mind works in making a decision or a choice, whether that customer is a consumer, or a retail category manager, or a B2B procurement committee, or a consulting client. We base our behavior on that theory: how to design a product for that customer, how to negotiate a contract, how to market to that customer, how to sell, how to service, how to price, how to manage the customer relationship. What if our theory is wrong or out of date, or the same theory doesn't apply to all customers in all situations, or we haven't thought about it enough and it's got holes in it? We might get disappointing results and have no idea why. Theory comes first. It can't be the other way around. Wait for results and wonder how to interpret them. We need theory first and then add the results data. If the theory needs strengthening or revising or modifying, that's called learning. Otherwise, it's just guessing. Our theories come from entrepreneurial economics. That's not the economics of money supply and GDP and the balance of payments. It's the economics of customers, of their ends and their aspirations, and how entrepreneurial businesses can design and supply the means for those ends and those aspirations and price them appropriately and make a profit, and all the other aspects of entrepreneurial business practice that require good theory for guidance. We have the best authority on the theory of entrepreneurial economics, Professor Per Bylund. Not only does he teach entrepreneurship as Records Johnston Professor of Free Enterprise at the School of Entrepreneurship at Oklahoma State University, he is also a leading researcher into issues in entrepreneurship, strategic management, and organizational economics. He writes regularly for Entrepreneur Magazine and Entrepreneur.com. He's immersed in both theory and practice of entrepreneurship. Hey, welcome back to the Economics for Business podcast.
Thanks so much for having me again.
It's always great to have you here, and we're going to address some questions of theory and application of theory today. We're often asked whether economic theory can be of real use to entrepreneurs in conducting business. And reading a couple of your papers recently, you've cracked the code on this question with all of your usual rigor and crystal clarity. And you've based it on foundational texts from the greatest thinkers in Austrian economics. So today we're going to summarize your argument about theory. We'll make reference to those papers, and then we're going to see if we can extend the thinking into the Economics for Business project that we're both working on, which is trying to help entrepreneurs to do better business. So let's start with the theory. And the first thing that I discovered is there is pure theory. And in a paper called Understanding the Limits of Pure Theory in Economics, you set out what Ludwig von Mises thought about the role of theory, the ultimate starting point. So let's begin at the starting point.
Yes, that's probably a good place to start, isn't it?
I would think so.
And that's sort of where Mises he starts by pointing out the starting point too, saying that since economics and any type of study of people in general, how they interact, what they do, what they accomplish, and things like that, needs to start with theory. So we need to have a conception of what it means to be a human being and what it means to act, because you can't really observe an action. So if you think about it as a physicist studying action, oh, they would see a body moving, and they might see some interaction with object. They might see some interaction with other bodies. But action itself is really not observable, right? So you already need some conception of what the heck is going on and what do we mean by action. And when we understand action as a human being, then we understand that when people do things, they're actually trying to accomplish something that they consider valuable. And that's the action axiom, as Mises calls it, that human action is purposeful behavior. And just we're aiming to accomplish something, which doesn't necessarily mean that we will get there. There are plenty of reasons why we won't, right? And any entrepreneur knows this, that they're trying to make a sale or they're trying to earn a profit and things like that. And it doesn't always work out the way you plan it. But you're aiming for something and you're learning while you're doing it and you're trying to get there. So when you're studying this, you already need conceptions. So you need to understand what people are doing and how they're thinking of and sort of perceiving the world around them. So what theory does is create a framework for analyzing what is going on. And not just like the physicist looking at the actual movements and the weight of the body and things like that, but instead trying to interpret and figure out what they're trying to achieve, how they went about it, what situation was it, and how are people likely to respond to it.
Yeah. Our mutual friend Mark Packard has called that a mental model. Is that a good way to think about it, that you've got to form a mental model about how somebody else is acting?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. And I mean, you don't have to understand exactly what they're aiming for, because that's very hard. I mean, that's sort of outside the scope of theory. But what you do realize and need to realize is that they are acting, right? And that they're also acting with respect to whatever they're perceiving. So we have many of these concepts that we study in social sciences. They're not really observable at all. It's not only action, but a firm itself. You can't observe a firm. You can't measure a firm. What is it? Well, economists don't actually know what it is, but that's a different topic, I guess. And the same thing with institutions and sort of patterns in how people act and react, and where we're headed. And culture is one of those big things that sociologists study, for instance. We think differently about things, but there's still a pattern involved. So in certain areas or in these cultural geographic areas, people think in a certain way, and in a different area, people think in a different way with respect to the same objects. So they can be in identical situations, but act differently, and there's still a pattern between how people act.
If I understand from the paper pair that we referred to, the distinctivity of Mises is that theory is not only a starting point for him, but a sufficient tool in its own right. It's entirely separate from empirical data and case studies and anything beyond the theory itself. Is that right? Am I interpreting what you said correctly?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. So to Mises, theory is sort of separate from, well, not reality. I mean, it is that framework that you use to make sense of what is going on, what you're actually seeing. So one of his statements in what I think is magnum opus, he says that one of the great powers of economics as a theory is to uncover what is actually happening, and that what is actually going on, the processes in the economy, are actually the reverse of what people assume when they just see things around them, right? So it uncovers the actual social processes that you can't really observe. And as such, theory, you can develop theory and then apply it to understand what is going on in the real world, but it's a separate field. So theory and the empirical economics are different. So theory itself is complete in a sense, but then of course, exactly what motivated a person's action, that's beyond what theory can say, but we know that something motivated their action, and we can draw conclusions about how society works and how the economy works and what will happen if, I mean, a favorite example of economists is what happens if the minimum wage is increased, right? Well, theory doesn't tell us how much to increase it or exactly what is the outcome, but we can tell what the outcomes will be if it's increased by a certain amount, right? So it's the framework we use to make sense of the situation.
Okay, very good. And then in that same paper, you compare the Misesian position on theory with Frank Knight, who also advocated pure theory, but in a different way. Can you explain the Knightian position and its difference from Mises for us?
Right. So he has said different, he sort of has the same view of what theory is and where it comes from, kind of. So it is the starting point where you begin by sort of reasoning about how the economy works. But then he says that, well, in order to expand this and explain specific situations, you need to add stuff from the real world. So it's sort of a step-by-step process where you add specific data and add specific characteristics of a situation in order to thereby get closer and closer to a specific phenomenon. So Mises would definitely not go here, because he would say no, theory is separate, because that's how we can rely on theory. As soon as we start introducing other elements into theory itself loses its power and its value to us, because now we don't know if it's actually true or not. But for Frank Knight, it's different. He says that's just the starting point, but then you sort of dilute it with empirics. And then you have a continuum between pure theory, which he calls approximate, because it doesn't exactly explain any specific situation. And then you have the specific situation, which everything you observe or feel, or when you're in that situation. And everything in between are sort of steps on the way between pure theory and pure inductive observation.
But he does say, as you mentioned, that each of those approximations that you take by adding empirics or facts dilutes the theory. The theory becomes weaker. So how does he resolve those two things? You're weakening your theory as you add more data.
Yeah, and to him, he was that kind of thinker that he always tried to find a balance between extremes in pretty much everything that he did. So what he's saying is that, well, theory itself, pure theory, it's somewhat useful. I mean, it's a good starting point, but in order to actually understand specific situations, you need to get closer to that phenomenon. And thereby you add step by step all these facts, and you get closer and closer. And then it says you need to find this middle ground, or this balance in between the two. And mysteriously, he says that it's pretty easy to find this balance. Although he doesn't actually say how, which is a little confusing, because either if theory is perfectly reliable, as Mises says, and empirics is not, it's almost a separate field of study. And Knight finds some sort of balance and says, oh, you should just add stuff. And he acknowledges that by adding facts, just like Mises says, you are diluting the theory and you're adding errors in a sense. So the actual explanation is less approximate, but it's also more likely to be false, which places a lot of burden on the scientist trying to figure out exactly where is this balance, and am I in the right place? Should I add more, or did I add too much? And from my perspective, how do you know?
Yeah.
How can you even tell?
But nevertheless, you co-authored a paper with Professor Marek Hudek, and the title includes the phrase, let's do it Frank's way. So what were you thinking as you developed that recommendation to let's do it Frank's way?
Well, right. So Frank's way, it's interesting in a sense, because different fields of study address different types of objects. So in economics, they study the economic system overall, and they can abstract from a lot of noise in a sense. A lot of specific, the specific nature of certain people and so forth. So they just abstract from the specifics. Whereas if you're studying entrepreneurship, you get much closer to the soft data, the interpretations, and how entrepreneur would act on their judgment, which is very difficult to use in the abstract for the economic system. And they would use such things as their feelings, emotions, and how they read people, and all of this stuff. So in order to study and understand entrepreneurs, you need to be less abstract and get away from that way too abstracted theory, in a sense, right? So what we do in this paper is discuss Frank Knight's view of how to do research and place different fields of study sort of along that continuum, from really abstract to very very observational or just fact based. So history would be a good example of something that is almost purely fact. We can argue whether that should be the case or not, but that's how they do it, right? So they look at a certain war and they collect as much data as possible about that war, and then they try to put all those pieces together, but there's no theory from which they start. They just try to make sense of what they have, right? Whereas economics is the other way around. Mises would start with theory to explain sort of the structure of the economy, and then, in a sense, fit in actual phenomena into that theory, use that theory to understand the phenomena.
A quick note. Did you know that we provide supplemental materials for each podcast? Listening to and understanding the key takeaways from our expert guests helps you think better about building a more beautiful business. Taking direct action and implementing these strategies is when the real work begins. Take a concrete, immediate step to implementing a better business model today by downloading the show notes and business tool we've created for this episode. Visit Mises.org/E4Bpod. That's MISES.org/E, the number 4, the letter B, POD, and click on today's episode. Now, back to our interview.
So can we interpret doing it Frank's way as that's a way that we can look at business, that entrepreneurs can look at business? They develop a theory and then they apply it to specific situations. They pull in more and more data and try to make it work for them to build their business. Is that appropriate?
Yeah, I think that is more than appropriate. I think that is exactly how you should go about it. So you should have a theory to begin with, and you should have an understanding of it. And we've talked several times about how you should have an Austrian understanding of how the market works.
Mm-hmm.
And that's abstract theory, and that's about what people value, how they value it, and what is capital, how does it work, and all of these things. But then, of course, when you're actually out there trying to sell to customers, you need to consider feedback from them. You need to consider how they're reacting to things, try different prices. Perhaps you have to pivot in response to what you're doing, because your business is not a theory, right? It's based on a theory, but then it is a specific situation. So you are definitely closer to that specific situation, and you need to make the most of it in order to make a profit.
Yeah, good. Well, I'm going to outline a specific example. It's one that I used to use in the consulting business that I think illustrates what we're talking about, and maybe you can comment on it and we can explore some others. So we used to take the very Misesian idea of the means end ladder, that in purposeful behavior, people have they have an end in mind, and then they choose the appropriate means to achieve that end, which, as you said, they may not be successful, but they make that choice. And that's straight from the action axiom, I think, purposeful behavior. And so as an example, we would try to derive the end that a consumer was aiming for. So let's say we're in the car market. So we're already in some specific area of business. And we identify an end, that one of my purposes for buying a car is to elicit admiration and indications of social success from other people. So in that situation, I might design a Ferrari or a Bentley that can best generate those kinds of feelings. It's a means to that end. But if the consumer is a construction company owner and wants to be more efficient and effective in carting things around for his business, he would want something more like a pickup truck. So I can design a useful pickup truck for him. So that's using the means end chain or the means end ladder to specifically design a means for the customer to achieve their end. So we thought that was a pretty good application of theory, and we were pretty successful sometimes at arriving at different solutions for different idiosyncratic customers. So is that a legitimate example of what we're talking about?
Yeah, it is. Absolutely. So, I mean, what you're doing is applying what we know from theory, that people have specific uses and specific wants that they want to satisfy. So, in your case, you have the guy who would want a Ferrari for certain reasons, or the pickup for completely other reasons, and they might be different people too, right? But exactly what they want and how, theory cannot tell you. But they can tell you that they will want a means that is suited for whatever end they're seeking, and that helps you find different market segments and separate them, in a sense, distinguish between them, distinguish between different types of customers, and so forth. And I mean, theory goes further, of course. I mean, you can use theory also to say that, well, there are always diminishing marginal utility of thing. So it could be the case that, well, the guy who wants a Ferrari might not need another one at all. So he gets the status and prestige from that one Ferrari, and then that's it. So he would place a value of 0 to the second one, perhaps. This tells you something about that market. But if you are catering to construction firms and selling pickup trucks, then having one is a huge difference from having 0 pickup trucks, because you can't do business at all. So that first one might be worth a whole lot to you. Buying a second one means you can scale up and expand the business a little bit, but it's not going to be as important as the first one. So you might be willing to pay for 2, but the first one you would be willing to pay more for than the second one. And the third one, well, you would consider it if the price is low enough, right? So we can use that pretty basic theory too, to get close to, okay, so how does this segment work compared to another segment? Well, we add the data that in terms of prestige, it doesn't add that much to have 10 Ferraris. But in terms of the usefulness for a construction firm to have 10 pickup trucks instead of 1, it might be very useful. So it could be the case that the pickup truck they're not willing to pay as much as they pay for a Ferrari for the first one, but they're willing to pay pretty much the same for a second one and a third one and a fourth one, depending on how big they think that the business will get. Right? So the value per item per customer falls perhaps much faster for a Ferrari than it does for a pickup truck. Yeah, and that's how you apply theory, and it reveals to you that theory says that this must be the case. It doesn't tell you by how much the value of a second automobile, how much lower that is than the first. But it does tell you that it has to be this way. And then you add your own experience and your own thinking of what types of people are in these segments. And you can sort of figure out that, oh, well, wait a minute. This should mean that maybe the pickup truck market is bigger, and lowering the price might have a greater effect on the quantity sold than if you lower the price of the Ferrari.
Yeah, the other thing we used to find, Per, was that the means are a combination. They're not individual. So there are trade-offs between how many seats you put in the pickup truck versus the size of the bed, or how many accessories you provided versus the price above which a certain buyer might not go. So the combination of means also emerge, which I think theory would say the same thing, right? People have a stack of preferences, and you've got to figure out how to combine them in the right combinations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this tells us something about bundling too.
Mm-hmm.
That yeah, if you cater to a certain want that people might have, and then you add a few more features, this type of featureism that a lot of at least inexperienced entrepreneurs are are involved in, that they
Mm-hmm.
add as they want to have something unique, so they start with an idea and then they add features until it's a unique thing. Well, you're going to lose people the more features you add because they might not want the combination of features. So they're not willing to pay for all those other features. Right? So more people might find something valuable with a thing, but the bundle itself might not be as valuable.
Right.
So yeah, there's plenty to, I mean, what we're doing in this podcast and the whole Economics for Business project, I mean, it is about making theory useful to entrepreneurs. And there's plenty you can do. It takes a little translation sometimes, but I mean, that's what we're doing here.
Yeah, exactly. Well, another theory of Frank Knight's and Mises and others is the whole theory area of uncertainty. And you and Peter Klein and others have identified a lot of ways in which entrepreneurs can try and deal with that with tools like empathy. We talk about empathy as a tool, or experimentation. You can't predict the future, so try lots of things and see what kind of returns you get from that. And you mentioned capital theory already. The most productive assets are the ones that are a stream of revenue from consumers in your portfolio. So are those examples of applying theory to practical and specific business choices? I know the theory is uncertainty, and so my choice is empathy.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's a way of, I mean, first recognizing that there is uncertainty,
Mm-hmm.
and then second, figuring out a way to deal with it and to bear it and sort of try to overcome it yourself. And empathy could be one of those. I mean, there are several examples of what you might do, and people have different strengths and weaknesses. So you should, of course, play on your strengths, but also given the situation you're in and the type of business that you're running and things like that, you make different choices. And I think theory can inform you in these situations. And I mean, that's basically what I do in my entrepreneur.com articles. I use theory to inform certain situations and certain ways of reasoning as an entrepreneur. But it doesn't give you the exact answer, because that's not what theory does. Because you have to consider all the specifics in the situation you're in. I mean, just the timing of things, for instance. Theory cannot tell you exactly when to launch, but it does tell you that it matters when you launch.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Another theory I've been reading a lot about recently is network theory, which is very important in building digital businesses. And I used to think it wasn't part of Mises and human action, but actually, if you go back and read it, it is, because he talks about action and interaction and the way those are interconnected. So he didn't use the word network, I don't think, but he was talking about network theory in a fashion. And there's a lot of findings now in network theory about the density of your connections and the number of nodes that are connected and how to connect to the right nodes and so on like that. And I'm reminded that the original Google search algorithm was a network theory. It was about how many links each page had to other pages. So maybe that's another example where entrepreneurs could usefully learn theory, network theory, and apply it to their businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so too. And especially, I mean, if you go a little further, not only that there is a network and how dense it is and so forth, but there also, I mean, the extension of the theory is that there's a difference between strong ties and weak ties. And there are such things as Bert talks about structural holes, where there are links missing, where you can easily, in a sense, expand your network and thereby your reach in the marketplace, or your reach in terms of getting, of securing competencies for your business, for instance. It might be the case that you are just one link away from finding someone who would be able to save your business, or from one link away from a banker who's more than willing to invest in your business, or what have you. But you're missing that link. So there is a structural hole in your network, and by thinking about it in this way, you might be able to actually identify where those holes are. I mean, theory is not going to tell you where the holes are, but it's going to tell you that there are such things as holes.
Mm-hmm.
It could be the case, I mean, just browsing LinkedIn or something, that you might be able to actually find that, oh, wait a minute, this guy could help me with exactly what I need, and we do have a contact in common, right? That you had no idea.
Right.
So it is important to use theory and to, I mean, leverage theory, really.
So another topic you mentioned in the paper about Let's Do It Frank's Way is a new form of economic analysis. You called it new entrepreneurial history. And I delved into that a little bit, and at least the papers I read on that, the focus is on trying to reconstruct the processes that entrepreneurs went through to identify opportunities in the first place, the creative process of seizing them, allocating and reconfiguring resources, and so on like that. So that sounds a bit like case histories, but maybe it's a little bit more than that, the way they reconstruct process. But tell us about new entrepreneurial history and what you think about that approach.
Well, that's really a way of figuring out what was going on by producing narratives around telling the story of how businesses, where they come from, how they grew, and how they took over the world, if it's one of those businesses, right? So it is about the case, but it's a case over time. So you're telling their story. In a sense, it's like a biography, if you will, over a business or maybe an industry or a situation. So many of those books that you can buy telling the story of these successful businesses and things like that, they're a little bit in line with this type of research, sort of digging deep and using trying to interpret what was actually going on and the people involved and how they what caused them to be successful, something that pure theory cannot tell you. But by analyzing sort of in a historical manner, so just like historians would analyze a war, you can analyze a business and try to figure out what actually happened and what was right about the timing, for instance, or how did they grow the business? How did they position themselves with respect to what later became their most fierce competition and all of these things?
And why is it new? What's the newness claim in new entrepreneurial history?
That's a good question. I mean, I guess it's I'm just speculating now, but I guess it's the interpretive aspect and the process view. I mean, process theory is something that is fairly new. It sounds a little strange, but looking at things in terms of the process that it sort of evolves over time, it's something that is really, really difficult to do using a level of scientific rigor, simply because you can't observe the process, right? You can only observe the data points, which are necessarily snapshots of what was going on. Well, then how do you fill in the blanks between the snapshots? Well, that's a little speculation, right? But using pure theory, you can sort of uncover these things. So you can use pure theory to figure out what happened in these historical case studies.
Yep. Yeah, I think you're right. And then the other piece that I've read about the claim of being new is because of the focus, sorry, on process, that avoids the great man theory or the great person theory of entrepreneurship, that Tesla isn't about Elon Musk, but it's about the distributed agency of everybody who thought about battery-powered cars and how you went from the first prototypes to a better idea and what the role of regulators is and all of those elements of the process and the network that instead of being the biography of a person, it's the biography of a process. So I think that's the claim.
Right. So it's taking a step back and looking at the fuller picture, right? We as humans, we really want to see that one great man doing things, like the king who conquered a continent or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the king did not conquer the continent because he left thousands dead in the fields, and another bunch of thousand soldiers were wounded and everything like that. So maybe he was a good strategist, but maybe there was a lot of luck involved too. And the same thing with entrepreneurship. And we see all the people involved, the situation, how you interpret it, what you're actually aiming for, how receptive you are to feedback and how you respond to it. And of course, the whole situation.
Yep. We've tried at the Economics for Business project to reconstruct some of those case histories. I don't think we're quite new entrepreneurial historians, but we've taken a case study. One example is our good friend Bob Luddy, who built a $500 million business from scratch called Captive Air. And he wrote a book about the experience. And so we turned that into a historical timeline and then tried to relate it to key process steps. So we're trying to construct those kinds of things. There was another interesting one on the internet the other day that I read about Patagonia, which I think is $1 billion company now. And the owner started as somebody who was interested in mountain climbing, and he was building metallic devices for, banging things into the rock and connecting yourself to them and so on like that. Eventually got into the whole field of clothing and equipment, but also was interested in environmental issues. And so he integrated those into the company. So you can go back and reconstruct that as a piece of history and think about the process. So Per, you mentioned our project, thanks, Economics for Business. We're also trying to do that forwards. And I'd like to get your point of view about how we can use theory and the application of it going forward. So we call the process that we're trying to build for entrepreneurs to follow the entrepreneurial GPS, like Google Maps. If you know where you are and you know where you're going, here are the steps to get there. And so you identify a goal and you try to identify the right steps to get there. We start with imagination, which includes empathy and making an imaginary construct, which we believe is consistent with Misesian economics, and then going on to design and assembly and the various things that entrepreneurs do. So is that a legitimate construct, do you think, to apply theory and try to apply it going forward?
Yes, I think so. I mean, theory helps us with the sort of the basic understanding and uncovering what is going on. I mean, what you're doing with the entrepreneurial GPS is adding detail to theory and sort of, in a sense, adding process, because theory can uncover the process that happens in real life, but it doesn't provide you with the process. And of course, as any entrepreneur knows, starting a business, yeah, it's a process, but it's never exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
But there are commonalities and there are phases and stages that you go through, especially if you're aiming for sort of the same thing. If you're aiming for growth, then you need to go through certain things. And if you're not aiming for growth, you might be able to skip those, right? So I think it's important to add this type of meat to the theory bones that the GPS is doing, and then as a practitioner, as an actual entrepreneur, use the GPS to add your own specificity to it, to add the situation you're in, to add the market that you have chosen, all of those things that are not part of a sort of this type of blueprint, but they're very specific to you. And I mean, like your specific goals. I mean, exactly what sales revenue are you aiming for and when? I mean, there's no model that's going to tell you that.
Mm-hmm.
You have to make up your mind. But if you have that goal, models and tools and these things can help you figure out how to get there in the easiest way possible. So, I mean, I often get the question, can you really teach entrepreneurship? I mean, a simple answer is no, you cannot. But what I can teach is how to avoid a lot of common mistakes.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you a different question, actually, Per, and that is, can entrepreneurs, business people learn to be good theorists? I mean, you're a brilliant theorist. You that's what you do. You are rigorous and clear, as we said at the beginning. You've invented new theories. Your theory of the firm is new, and the idea of the specialization lockup is new. Can entrepreneurs learn to be good theorists? Can they practice?
Oh, of course. No, I think any entrepreneur will agree that the more experience you have as an entrepreneur, the better entrepreneur you can be. And the same thing it's the same with everything, that the more practice you have, the easier it gets, and you can focus on other things that you might fail at, right? So practice makes perfect in a sense, and I don't think there's any such thing as a perfect theoretician or a theorist or a perfect entrepreneur either. But you can get closer to it, and you can avoid these mistakes. And in a sense, I would say, I mean, developing theory and being an entrepreneur, they're similar in a way, because you need to consider what is, and then you need to think in new ways about it. So as a theorist, I mean, what I try to do, which might not be the case for everybody, I don't know, but what I try to do is take the theory that is, reconsider some things that don't sit right with me. So I try to change the assumptions or figure out better ways of doing it, and also extend it in ways that haven't been done before. I mean, if it's obvious, it's not really a contribution. So I have to think in new ways about it. And it's exactly the same what entrepreneurs do. I mean, they're in a situation, they can see a lot of the things that they see are the same things that everybody else can see, but they see opportunities that others might not. And they see that they can do something differently here, and they can compete with whatever incumbents are in that market by doing something in a very different way, because they think there's value in that. So it's, in a sense, the same structure to it. Of course, it's very different running a business and developing theory in practice, but the structure of it is the same. It's taking what is, questioning it, and finding new ways to think about it.
Yeah, and I also think there's a allocation of time issue here as well. To apply theory, you're going to apply it in decision making, you're going to apply it in process design and various other forms of management. But it merits taking some time to develop the theory to begin with. In a recent podcast with Bart Jackson, who studied a couple of thousand CEOs and how they do the job of CEO, which is a really tough task, has a lot of time allocation questions to it. He said they take time to think. And you carve out part of your day, a part of your week, you take time to think. And that thinking has probably got a lot to do with theorizing.
Oh, for sure. I mean, and it takes a lot of practice to be a good thinker too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, most people think that they can think, but I mean, it's the sad truth is that many of them are pretty bad at thinking. But if anybody can learn it, I have no doubt about that. But it's about being curious and trying to find structure and logic in whatever it is that you're struggling with, whatever problem you need to solve. There is a solution to it first, and you can find it if you just think about it the right way.
Good. Well, let's see if we can wrap up for people, Per. We're going to do it Frank's way. We're going to think about theory, develop theory, have a theory, which we're always going to be testing, but then we're going to add data to it, as you said, i.e. by designing processes, making trade-offs, making decisions, but always start at theory. I think is that a good summary?
I think that's an excellent summary. Yeah. I mean, you can't really do it the other way around, right? Because a theory is the framework through which you interpret the world. And theory needs to be reliable and true. Well, if you do it the other way around, you start with a bunch of observations and you don't have any clue what they actually mean, and they just put them together, you can end up with any random conclusion. So yeah, you need to start with theory, and then when you're applying it, I mean, it allows you to see new things, to uncover what is actually going on, and that you can exploit, and that you can act on, and start a business or whatever it is you want to do. But then only through starting with theory can you get to that point where you can benefit from it.
Good. Well, Per, thank you as always for explaining a difficult topic to us in a way that we can all understand. And I think we can go forward examining our own theories and making sure that we A, have one, and B, testing it for how accurate it might be. Thank you.
Thank you.
Economics for Business is a production of the Mises Institute. To explore more content like this, visit Mises.org. And for more from Hunter Hastings, visit hunterhastings.com.